I feel enormously gratitude to both you guys because I probably you're two of the guys I listen to the most and follow the most, and who give me a vocabulary, in which to see the world and think about the world the most. So that's where my gratitude is. Besides the fact that I just love listening to you guys talk. So maybe I'll just say welcome. This is on the Parallax channel, which is our sort of magazine video channel now. And what I'd like to know first, before I get into my questions, is I just want to know what you guys are up to. What kind of projects, like new insights you've been having, plans. I know Zak mentioned something called the Conciliatory Project, which he's working with Daniel Schmachtenberger on. And I'm always following John's conversations with Greg and all kinds of people. So what's new? What's going on?
Why don't you go first, Zak?
Sure. Yeah, as Andrew said, the Consilience Project has been occupying most of my time. This is myself, Daniel Schmachtenberger, a team of people who are attempting to address these issues in the kind of information ecosystem and digital media landscapes. And we talked about some of these issues. I think the last time we spoke, just how captivating and identity changing social media and the news is and these kinds of things. And so I've actually literally been spending the past few weeks writing what we call meta news analysis. And that's when you take a particular issue and you literally do as exhaustive a look across as many news stories as you can, and then thematically analyze it and do argumentation analysis and a landscape narrative, and basically capture a news cycle in a kind of theoretical frame and then draw lessons from it. And so that's been very interesting, both in terms of seeing really taking a deep analytical eye at the nature of what the reporting actually looks like on all sides. And then moving above that at an epistemological level and showing out, where the growth in learning and epistemological sophistication needs to happen, or else we're just going to keep going deeper into, basically irreconcilable views based on conversations where there's no way to ground in evidentiary arguments. So that means that the irreconcilability becomes completely entrenched. You can't resolve it because of the nature of the way the arguments are being constructed on both sides. So we're trying to just make this clear in such a way that things like meta news analysis become more common and an accepted way of running a kind of quality control on the state of the news media. Because the long-term effort of the Consilience Project is to build a distributed movement around sense-making. I think that's comparable to the movement that emerged in the 60s and 70s around environmentalism. Basically saying like, there's an existential threat here to planetary civilization. Can we identify it? And can we begin to identify ourselves at the level of our personality? Like, you can be an environmentalist. And that means you're someone who's deeply concerned about the state of the environment. So there needs to be something comparable in the realm of, let's say, sense making, right? This notion that, in fact, I want to identify, kind of self-consciously ascribed to being someone who is working in the interest of fixing the information ecosystem at epistemological level. So that we're trying to because there's a ton of people who see it from different angles, who see the dysfunction of the information ecosystem and are taking different approaches to it. And so the idea is to try to name that phenomenon and try to galvanize a movement, so that the meta news analysis and other things we do are examples to be emulated, so that about 5 years from now, Consilience Project can kind of step out and the movement continues to move. And it needs to become as significant as the environmental movement.
So it's sort of a environment of mind in a way.
It's precisely, it's the ecologies of our minds are being deeply polluted and corrupted. And to the extent that we lose capacity to identify that it's happening. Some of the problems with lessening of psychological capacity, it's called anagnosia, right? Which is the inability to know you don't know as a result of capacity degradation. So it's kind of like saying there's a epistemological event horizon, you cross it and you can't get back to, we need to recapture a lot of territory that's been lost in the public sphere around sense making. So this is what is happening. So it's like restoration, like we need to fix the existing news media, and then conservation of the stuff that's already good, right? We need to figure out the vetting and the curation of the conservation effort, and then regenerativity. New forms need to emerge that allow for healthier ecologies of mind. So that's the nature of the work. And we could go into the meta news, but there's a lot of detail there.
And that must be
linked.
many
iterations to figure out how to even do the form of analysis. And there are some groups out of Oxford and an emerging work in what's called forensic journalism, where they're looking at digital propaganda and computational warfare and things of that nature. And that ends up being relevant to the meta news. Not all virality, like not everything that goes viral is organic. You've got botnets, and you've got all kinds of private, which is to say like companies and state intelligence agencies and other actors intervening in the media ecosystem. So it's very interesting what we're kind of discovering and what we're going to be kind of bringing to light and trying to galvanize people around. And it's the thing that needs to get fixed before any of the other conversations can happen, is why it's so critical. So that's where I've been at. So my head's been deep in the news, which is of course pretty depressing. And then the side project on Comenius. And I think we spoke about John Amos Comenius once before, the great 17th century educational reformer. And that just continues to be an incredibly deep vein, completely unexpected to me. And so I'm going to keep mining that and do some publishing on that at some point. So that's what I've been up to.
So maybe we can keep on this sort of educational kind of vein and speak more about that. And I'm also wondering the connection to what you talked about meta psychology with this whole business of meta information and meta news, and if we could make a link to that perhaps in our conversation. So John.
First of all, I've been invited to partake in and participate in the Consilience Project with Daniel and Zak, and I'm looking forward to that. And I'm now looking forward to it even more because of what Zak just said. And I've had a conversation with Daniel too. And so I'm prepared to give that my best because I agree with Zak. I think this is really important. I don't have anything to say about it right now because I'm on the outside looking in, but when I hope that I can make a contribution. Some of the work that I'm doing that might contribute, I don't know. I've been doing a lot of work on trying to get very clear about when people, what the understanding part of making sense. What's the difference between knowledge and understanding? And what pedagogical difference does that make? And that has taken me into the work I've been doing elsewhere, but I'm trying to put the two together about a Platonic notion of plausibility as the standard we use for taking things seriously as opposed to pronouncing them true or false. And so the idea here is we had an epistemology set up around truth and falsity, and then the standard of justification is supposed to be asymptotically certain. You're supposed to get certainty, and that's a Cartesian model, and we are all familiar with all of the deep problems with that. But another problem with it, and perhaps exacerbated by those previous problems, is it's a very slow process. And the problem is that people need a process that can be handled more online, where it isn't required that you that you sort of step back into a lab for an extended period of time and then come back and make your evaluations. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't be doing the meta news. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying is that people also need, they need frontline strategies too. And they need to be more aware, and they need to be empowered to know what to take seriously significantly before they decide whether or not it's true or false. So I think what's happening is those two things are being deeply confounded and conflated together and therefore what's often happening is the way, and one way you can confound them together is I take what is intense seriously, and what is serious is what is true, and so intensity is truth, and I see that happening very, very much. And then, as Zak says, that is just fertile ground for manipulation, because if you get people to conflate intensity with truth, then you can promote outrage, you can promote, you can promote greed, you can think of all the things, many of the vices that we're concerned about, if you'll allow me that term, have to do with that fundamental confusion. And so I'm making use of work of Nicholas Rasher and Milgram and a whole bunch of other people about, okay, what is it we're doing? And it's a dialogical thing. And that's very clear in Plato. What are we doing dialogically so that we're not agreeing on the propositions of a topic, but we're agreeing that something should be taken seriously. And how are we vetting that? Because the problem for many people is they can't make that initial discernment. And because of that, if you can't make that initial discernment, your ability, your relevance realization ability to track truth just goes haywire. It just goes haywire. So I've been trying to think about that and see how that bears upon this ongoing project I have of trying to generate a practice that affords what I call dialogos, these open-ended, and how they involve us trying to cultivate wisdom together with respect to not a definition of any particular virtue, but the lived capacity to take virtue seriously again. And that's a very different thing. That's what, and I think that's the core of the Socratic project. You don't get the definitions of any of the virtues. What you get is, if you follow Socrates, and people don't, they often don't know, right? But if you follow Socrates, what he's doing is he's getting you to take it very seriously, like take it very seriously, and as worthy of something to pay more attention to. And so I want to try and bridge those together. I'm not quite sure how, but the idea is, like, at the level of attention, before we get to the level of proposition, right, generation, like, are we empowering people to be able to say, we should spend more time there, because that's what it means to take something seriously, and we should not spend time there. That's something that I'm really focused on right now.
That's wonderful.
What I thought of, just to throw a few things in here, I wondered about the connection between Zak's term ensoulment and dialogos, because it seems to me that ensoulment is what is needed, right? Rather than just this binary thinking of good and evil and love and hate. It seems like the internet drives everybody into this binary mode, right? Where there is no dialogue. And we lose our souls, as Jack was sort of describing. Yeah.
I think the term ensoulment, I mean, you and I and Chris have talked about soul, and trying to get back the idea that ensoulment has to do, I was just talking with Jordan about this, and about, why people who've experienced grief are more trustworthy than people who have not. Because there's a kind of participatory knowing that is possible between people who've experienced grief, so that you and I can internalize each other's perspective in a very profound way that isn't possible when one of us is avoiding grief. And of course, our culture is very grief avoidant. It's extremely grief avoidant.
And at the same time, in the midst of a massive tragedy, which
yes,
they're not willing to digest or live through, emotionally, or.
Well, that's when you see grief avoidance, when there should be grief.
Yes,
yes. And so this is wonderful. I mean, you don't realize, John, how relevant what you were saying actually is to precisely the meta news I was working on, because one of the main things we're seeing in the media ecosystem is, and it's obvious once you say it, is presenting the plausible as true, right? Yeah. Or the converse, which is presenting the plausible as obviously false, right? Yeah. But the ability to hold a set of claims as plausible, and then to figure out what to do with a set of competing plausible claims, That's an example of one of the things, as I'm telling the meta news story, that I pulled out into a box, which is just like an epistemological reflection on the state of the media, that says, hey, we need to start paying more attention to when we move instantly from the plausible to the true, or
Yes.
the opposite flip. And so it's a very essential capacity. And so I'm wondering, well, there's a few things. One is there's something like a negative capability. So there's something like an ability to not know, first of all, and that needs to be held as a value. And actually, you need to be in a context where that's okay. So a lot of what you see, and this is another epistemological pull-out box that I wrote, was about, so the need to make a decision quickly is antithetical to the ability to hold multiple things as plausible, right? Like those two can't exist. And so the extent to which the news cycle is rapid and the Facebook feed is rapid means you actually have a ton of incentives to not engage in the space holding of the multiple plausible things, but rather to just lock on one. And so, we see it on both sides. We see, people taking things way more seriously than they should. And then we see people dismissing things as conspiracy theory or whatever, which actually need to be taken a lot more seriously. And the conversation of what does it mean for something to be plausible? What are the different degrees of plausibility? Like there's a whole bunch of stuff which can occur in human communication, which seems to have been systematically omitted from a lot of the public culture. And the question of how to bring that back in is one of the main ones we're grappling with. Sometimes I work with a term just called reasonableness. And this I get from
reasonable.
That's actually should be used. Nicholas Rescher, on his book on plausible reasoning, says there's two meanings of plausible and we should not equivocate between them. One is a synonym for highly probable, and that's an empirical judgment. There's another meaning, which is it's reasonable, it stands to reason, we should take it seriously. And if you look through even a hard-nosed scientific article, you'll see people making plausibility judgments all the way through. And so I just want to say something very quickly as a proposal for a bit of the work I'm doing. I'm sort of writing a book, and because it'll give me some language to talk about this, if that's all right. I don't want to trespass, but
no, do it.
So, and what everything I say, there's sort of experimental evidence for it, right? But one idea is people judge, they tend to, if not being distorted or distracted or what, so under sort of optimal circumstances, 1/2 of plausibility is people's judgments of trustworthiness. And what they're looking for, often very implicitly, is they're looking for independent lines that converge. So independent things. That's why we prefer something that we both see and hear and touch over something we just see. And babies do that, like from the beginning. Because, and here's the reason, that's not certainty, but it's this idea. If I have just one information channel, the chance that the result is due to bias is significantly high. But if I have multiple independent converging ones, the chance that they all share that bias is actually very low. So it's reducing, like trustworthiness is seeking convergence as a way of saying, chances are that it's less driven by bias. But that's not all you need. You need the opposite, right? You need that whatever you've come to has the potential to be elegant, to be divergent, and apply to many different areas to be effective. Now, and you need them to balance. So if you have if you want a lot of elegance, if you want to say, I can take this and apply it here and here and here and here and here, you need to have a lot of convergence. And now think about where people sense an imbalance. One way they sense an imbalance is lots of trustworthiness, but not much elegance. What do people pronounce that? They pronounce that trivial. They say that's trivial, right? What's the opposite? Very little convergence and a lot of elegance. People say that's far-fetched. And then what you can do is you need convergence, elegance, and balance between them. But what you can do is you can bullshit on it, you can equivocate. You can do like a Mott and Bailey strategy. You sound like you're saying something really elegant, and then you equivocate and you're only saying something that's trivial, but it has a lot of trustworthiness. And that feels like it was plausible because you felt the elegance and then you feel the trustworthiness, but it's because of an equivocation, right? And so there's lots of ways in which people manipulate that balance so that people are misled into thinking they have it. And conspiracy theories often work that way too. And so I'm trying to understand what I'm not doing it in media, but I'm trying to understand. I've been looking at it in science. Like, what do scientists do to try and do this when they're making a judgment that that's a trivial thing, or that's truistic, or that, right, or that's far-fetched? They do the same. They do that too. They say that's far-fetched. And so it seems like these are the implicit judgments they're making. And then the question I have is, yes, but can we take that out of sort of an academic arena, and can we give that skill to people, as you said? Like, I was thinking about it in conversation, but and that's why we like those conversations where where you get that convergence, and that people come to sort of a consensus, and then it blows out with insight that you get that in circling practices all the time.
Can I bring in a word here, and that's Tools for Conviviality, which is a book by Ivan Illich. And it seems to me that that's the word conviviality I like very much. I've heard Jordan use that as well.
Yeah.
As being a kind of environment where real education and real dialogos and all this could happen. So I wonder what you think about that. I know Zak is a fan of Ivan Illich and has read his books, and I read them a lot when I was younger. But even the title of that book seems to say so much to me, that what we need is to get away from this clinical, terrible environments, right, which are so destructive, and enter environments which are like a womb, or like a which something is being created on all levels, and things are happening, Well,
what I would say to that is, I think we need kind of a Bowlby thing. I think we need secure attachment. I think we need places where we can go to, where we can do that, but we have to be able to take that out into. I think if we try to make social media a home, that's a long task.
Oh no.
And I think there's intermediate steps that we have to go through before we could ever get to that. So I think there should be places where there's conviviality, where we can readily internalize each other because of trustworthiness and insight. These two things we want to give us a sense that something should be taken seriously.
Seems we need both. We need a world in media, but we also need time out of media, and that has to be as important as being in it or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I would say. But my hope is to make that an educational thing, like the secure child. The child goes home, goes back to the mom, unloads some stress, gets back their cognitive flexibility, and then goes back out into the world again. That's the model I'm sort of trying to think. And I'm trying to think of the Dialogos space as a space where people can home, do the conviviality. Think about how people enter, think about what's happening in the circling practices. Like I said, people start to get this sense of intimacy, trustworthiness, and insight, and they're bouncing off of each other. And they take this very, very seriously. And I think I'm seeing it as a place where people can practice these kinds of skills, develop a taste, and then take them into the media so they can say, well, that doesn't taste plausible. And I was talking to Jordan about this, of how the sacred has, and perhaps could be again, a place where we practice our taste for what should be taken seriously. And we're trying to do that. Did that make much sense? I was trying to.
Totally. Yeah. The idea that the opposite of the sacred is like the superficial or something.
Yeah.
The sacred actually has to do with those things which are of ultimate significance and concern.
Yes.
And I completely agree. I mean, it's fascinating what you're saying, because the trustworthiness, reasonableness, these are qualities that we were running intuitive social. They're actually social scripts. So it's the information is trustworthy, but actually it's the person who wrote the information who's ultimately the source of the trustworthiness.
Yeah.
So there is something about the social ground behind the epistemological claims, which is also part of what's been so
That's a good
distorted.
point.
Like
Yeah.
that Facebook are not tools for conviviality. They're like the opposite, whatever the opposite of tools for conviviality would be. But that the possibility of the kind of dialogos you're talking about, and what I call ensoulment very often, has to do with a lot with the appropriate context of conversation. So like at the end of the day, the Consilience Project needs to be a series of what Daniel calls interstitial dialogues, which is a way of saying that there's a need to display for people to remember, to recall that these forms of, let's say, resonant, reasonable conversation are home.
Yes.
But to get in there, you actually need to start trusting people again. And that's where the ensoulment dynamic comes in. That's about what's actually the image of self that you move into the social field with, right? And so I think the limits placed on the dynamics of ensoulment, this is your point about people who've experienced grief, right? And the trustworthiness of someone who's experienced grief. That's the thing, that it's not that we're cognitively capped, although I think that's happened. And it's not that we don't have access to enough states of consciousness, right? Like meditation, drugs, etc.
Yeah.
It's this dynamic of maturity, let's say, or ensoulment or character formation.
Yeah.
That's actually the problem with the epistemological issues there, even though it seems to be in the realm of thinking or in the realm of like lacking clarity. It's actually in the realm of this deep interpersonal trust and reasonableness dynamic, right? Like, to call you a reasonable, I need to basically say that you are responsible, sovereign person who, just by virtue of being a person, needs to be taken seriously and listened to. It's the notion of reasonableness. So to dismiss somebody as, by virtue of some signal they've sent or how they appear, as not to be listened to, almost in principle, like this is a stance that's completely unreasonable, even though it might be completely rational, which is to say, help you solve a problem. It's not reasonable because it doesn't respect the dignity that's necessary to respecting the other, to have that sense of trust and security, to allow the dialogue to go where it will go. Because that's ultimately what you're saying. If we're entering into this relationship, then it's going to go where it goes. And I have to trust that you're not going to be manipulating that. And I know that I'm not going to be manipulating that. This is the only way to reach the unforced force, the non-coerced force of mutual understanding.
You have to believe that people are not instrumentalizing what you're doing and who you are, and there's not, somebody doesn't have a knife in their back pocket at the same time as they're talking to you, which you often feel from people, because they're so afraid and they're playing a game, and you know.
And you have to have an image of yourself as being non-instrumental.
Yeah.
It's like you have to be brought up in an educational culture that wasn't every time you're with someone, it's a zero-sum game for who's smarter, which is how schools actually teach us to behave. You know what I mean? So like there needs to be a sense of, in your own image of self and the image of other you project. You know, what's the imaginal space that holds this conversation? What are we doing together? Do we share a similar image of the work we're doing?
Great. That's a great segue to what I wanted to talk about, the image and symbols and that kind of thing. And I'm really inspired by what you've been saying about psychology and metapsychology in terms of the image. And I think you said that the image is the most dangerous thing in a sense, right? And today we are bombarded by you could almost say demonic imagery, on some level, if I can use these kind of language. And yet we need stable, am I correct to say we need sort of these images? We need to have images at the basis of things which are generative and or alive or.
Yeah, there's a lot packed in there, because I'm using image and imagination and imaginal and like some very specific ways, and same with symbol and image being distinct. And so there's a lot to say there, but yeah, in the model that I've laid out in those Stoa lectures, the reason image is so important is because of the place of the ensoulment dynamic in relationship to development and transcendence, which is to say that there's the root metaphor of self, or the core image I have of who I am and what the world is, which is, let's say, not entirely linguistically consciously available, sometimes revealed to you in dreams or in your allurement to certain archetypes or images and other things. Very reflective, mature people can often articulate the reflective self sense captured in metaphorical language. That thing is what drives development and motivates tools that get transcendent. It's basic pedagogy. If you want a kid to learn to read, don't just drill him and kill him on reading. Explain to him why reading is something that he should want to do. Why would you want to have the image of yourself as a future reader, right? Like the motivating identity constituting image of self drives development, etc. And so what that means is that exogenous images of self are overrunning the attention, which doesn't allow enough play for the endogenous image of self. This is the way I've characterized it. So that's the process of the constraint of unique ensoulment has to do with the absence of potent, imaginal material, non-commodified, non-homogenized, like real raw image building, self-building material, which is what many cultures have provided, and which I think our culture is now kind of like preying on, which is to say, like they're using the very things, and this is common in like superhero movies and things, the exact kind of like archetypal properties of the images, which can infuse the self, are used, but attached to something that doesn't have sacred qualities. Right? And so the inability to have a sacred sense of self, which is the height of ensoulment, right? The post-tragic re-sacralization of self and world. And that you can't even get it if the only images you have access to are those exogenously provided to you by a culture that's not even interested in your ensoulment, but rather just capturing your attention. So it's kind of like so this is the danger of the image, but also the power of the image. And remember, like the Catholic Church outlawed images. You know, like there's always been a very serious religious concern with images, or rather it's Protestants, right? Somebody, we're always debating actually about which images are allowed, which ones are not. And so in any case, so there's a lot there. And the root, of course, is the dream. Like that's the archetype of the image, if you want to say, because especially as an endogenous image creating and revelatory process, and this is of course where so much psychotherapeutic work began, was what the hell does that image mean? Like where did that come from, and what does that tell you about the deeper processes of who you believe yourself to actually be, despite what you tell people you think you are? What is the actual image of yourself you truly believe? And that's where the dream work and other factors come into that. And
well, I'm wondering about the tension between, let's say, iconography and traditional imagery and religious imagery, and I'm a Vajrayanist, so it's a very symbolic path. So we work with images all the time. And then post, I guess post tragic or post narrative spirituality, or when I guess when psychoanalysis comes along, then we're working with images then we're working with whatever arises in our minds and from nowhere or something. I know John, you've been talking to some people about sort of, narrative and post-narrative religion, or symbolism and post-symbolism. And I wonder if you could speak to that.
Sure. And I want to just say that I think it's a point of convergence, which contributes to taking something seriously between Zak and I. The notion of the soul as the psyche as sacrament, the taking of the depths of the self and its vocational relationship to the depths of reality as the locus of the sacred. I think that is the project right now. And again, one of the things grief does for us is it takes us to depths of the psyche that other things can't. And it actually puts holes in the walls of our egocentrism if we're willing to look through them, by which we can see more deeply into other people. But so I think I want to keep bouncing off that, because that's a really cool, I think that's a really, I was going to say cool, that's an inadequate word. I think that's a really important idea. What I would want to say, and I liked what Zak said, he was very careful. He kept saying imaginal, and I suspect he's invoking Corbin's distinction between the imaginary, and I've had and I've even had the privilege of having a long discussion with Thomas Cheetham about Corbin. And I think that's important because, so the distinction very briefly is the imaginary is what is our mental images, and the imaginary has an orientation of trying to simplify. It's like it's an avoidance strategy. It's an avoidance of reality. It's escapist, right? And then the imaginal these are images that are transjective. We enact them. They're between us and depths of ourselves, between our mind and our body. We're enacting these images between our mind and our body, right? We're enacting these images between us and other people. We're enacting these images between us and other worlds. And so you can think of two different senses of imagination. You can think of, like, I'm imagining a sailboat and I'm just making a mental picture in my head. Or you can think of a kid imagining that a piece of plastic is a sword. Exactly. And they're enacting it. And the difference between those two goes to a very important, to my mind, argument made by Tolkien. So Tolkien he wrote an essay defending fantasy literature. That's what we would call it. He didn't quite call it that. I think he called it fairy stories or something, right? But the point is, he said, insofar as it's escapist, it should be criticized. And that's what he said. But he says, what he was trying to do is he's trying to do the following. He's trying to create a world, a fictional world, and it's imaginal in this way. You go into that world, you enculturate in that world, so that it's like an anthropological journey, so that when you return back to this world, you see it in ways you couldn't see it before. It's kind of like an augmented reality. We get this image, but what it allows us to do is realize the biases that we're projecting onto the world. And I think that the job of religions, and I hope people don't take me wrong for, I think the job of religion was the serious play with, right, the imaginal, to do a kind of augmented reality that was tested by whether or not it actually transferred to life, right? And so I think what I'm trying to I think amplify what Zak said. I think that's fair. I think our culture equivocates between these two things in a reductionist manner. It has, maybe equivocate is even too weak. It has tried to reduce the imaginal to the imaginary. Yes. And by doing that, it has actually driven people, often unawares, into an inherently avoidant stance towards the world and other people. And there's a very thin line between avoidant and adversarial, because if I'm avoiding you and you try to make contact, and notice the phrase we now use, I'm going to push back against you. There's going to be pushback because I want to avoid you. So I think there's deep connections between the reduction of the imaginal to the imaginary, an implicit stance of avoidance, and the attitude of pushback as a sort of fundamental way in which we're seeing how we relate to other people in the world. That's something I just wanted to put out there on the table as something that I see happening. And I think recovering the image as an icon for imaginal augmentation, as opposed to an idol for avoidance and escape, is the proper role of the sacred in that sense.
Beautiful, yeah. And I think I don't know if I can bring up my own tradition or what I practice is you would try to replace it. You wouldn't be trying to improve yourself in a psychological sense. You'd be trying to replace the psychosomatic image with a sacred image and work with that on some level, right? Or you would try to replace, like in Vajra, they say like you would try to replace ordinary reality and say that nothing is ordinary, which is kind of the opposite of Zen, where they say, you know, ordinary reality is the truth. But in Vajrayana, we say nothing is ordinary, right? So the delusion is that everything is ordinary, and you try to replace that by working with these images of you know.
No, and the Imaginal is so powerful because it is your projection across the world. It's exactly like you're saying. It's in the realm of the Imaginal that the world becomes extraordinary.
Yes.
It is, and that's what's so interesting about the denial of the Imaginal by kind of the late modern scientific culture is that.
Yeah. And even the Renaissance, like Michelangelo and stuff, it's all this realism comes in, right? Which denies the Imaginal as well, because it becomes this literal realism of some sort.
This is it. So you deny the Imaginal, and then what happens is then there's like the return of the repressed or something. And so insofar as science then starts to take on a kind of religious quality, because it begins to actually offer people a disowned imaginal framework, right? So if you imagine like what it's like to walk around, when I always make this point with like neuroscientists and physicists, I'm like, you don't use your scientific descriptive imaginal overlay when you're looking at your daughter and seeing her basically as a coagulation of neurons and then ultimately quarks or something. But that's the imaginal projection of the scientific reality, right? And so it's important to get that like we live in imaginal projections, even if we disown the imaginal. And so
stories too, because science is kind of a story. Like John makes
it's absolutely a story.
And an atom doesn't really look like an atom; it's a drawing of an, you know.
Right. Yeah. So it's like I'm walking down the street thinking, okay, who am I? What am I? And I'm imagining as I'm looking through them. I'm not closing my eyes, imagining a sailboat. I'm looking at the world and projecting my mind. What is all this around me? And you can see how some stories would lead you basically to live in a dead, meaningless universe. You would project that into the world, and other stories would make the universe enchanted. And that's where the imaginal can get a bad name in relation to the imaginary, which is that because of the return of the repressed, we've had people trying to take imaginary things and lay them over the world as if they're imaginal.
Yes.
And that just simply doesn't work. And this is the whole point about the archetypal, is that if you do the imaginal and soul building work right, then your projection of the imaginal across the world touches realities within the world. And then there's a mutual, and you learn. Your imagination allows you to learn about the archetypal realities that you encounter. If your imaginal projection doesn't hit any archetypal realities, then you're in a state of delusion usually.
Well, here's where I want to make another convergence point, because there is a place where we have to, even if we won't admit it, enact the imaginal. And that's in genuine dialogos, because I have to, the problem is we have the same verb, but I mean imagine in the sense of imaginal. I have to imagine your perspective if I'm going to truly listen to you. And I have to internalize it. That's an inherently imaginal act. And one of the advantages of when people are in dialogos is they recognize that. And I recognize that this is a place where my imaginal projections have the opportunity to challenge and speak back to me if I'm willing to listen.
Right. Yeah, that's so fascinating. It's exactly the reasonableness quality that we've been, it is in fact that we're living in the same shared imaginal projection of what this conversation is.
Yes.
You know? I think about like the Old Testament where they're like, you know, these two dudes are on the road and they're like sorting out some contract or something. Oh, and God's there. Right. Yeah. And the idea there is that they both know that, right? Like there's a sense of shared imaginal framing where it's not, we're both alone on the road in a meaningless universe and there's no moral law because everything evolved out of pure chance and we just project meaning on the universe. And therefore, if I screw you over, there'll be no ultimate consequence. And that's the shared frame. The shared frame is actually, no, there is a God that is watching us and my behavior matters and my words, you know, should be my bond and et cetera, et cetera. And so it's interesting to see that moral identity, communication, conversation, possibility, all the result of basically are we living in the same cosmovision, right? Are we living in the same projected imaginal reality of what the world is that we're participating in? And of course, with the reality bubbles and reality tunnels of our current, back to the Consilience Project, digital media thing, it's very hard to get into a conversational space, present company excluded, where you do have some sense of like, okay, there's enough overlapping kind of like shared senses of what is ultimately of concern here to fall into a trusting, emergent, dynamic conversation. And that may be impossible to do in online asynchronous text exchange, just period. And so that's, I think, one of the tricks. And it may also be very difficult to do with the press.
You mean email? When you say asynchronous text exchange, you mean it's impossible to do with email?
Well, it's impossible to do on
or
Facebook,
SMS or
anything where you are not in real time speaking with someone, or not even speaking with them, but actually just typing. There's a ton of research to show how little conveyance there is.
Oh yeah.
And it gets painful often, right? For no reason.
It gets very painful.
Conversations you have with people on email.
No, it's intense.
Some people are just, don't care and kind of like steamroll over you, and other people are very sensitive. And I don't know. It's like it's for me, email is quite stressful as a medium. Or mm-hmm.
I as a kid, I disliked talking on the telephone because the person wasn't present. I couldn't see their face. And I, as pedagogical practice, I won't get into an email conversation that's more than 5 sentences long with any student. I put that in my course policy. If it's more than 5 sentences, we need to talk, insofar as that's possible. So I'm wondering, Zak, if and this goes to the stuff I'm doing around this concern around narrative, because I'm interested in. Well, here's a proposal, and that's really how I mean it to be taken, that I see narrative as that which, mediates between dialogos and worldview. That what it does is it specifies the worldview into a local situation, or a local kind of situation, I should say more accurately, but it also takes, the non-propositional communing and turns it into communication. And so I see sort of this stack of like dialogos, narrative, worldview, and I see it like I see the lines of causation. I guess that's the right word, going both up and down. Like it's a bottom up and top down, and I see narrative in the center because I'm really interested in this question, which I think is pertinent right now. I'm really interested in the question is how do people adopt a narrative, right? Or how do they move between narratives? And part of what I'm hearing people say is, well, they do it via narrative, and then there's an infinite regress that I find just unacceptable as an explanation. It's like, but that's like, and to me, that's exactly analogous to how do people adopt a culture, right? Or how are people enculturated? They have to have pre-cultural abilities that make it possible, and so I'm interested in, because I'm having these discussions. And I brought this up explicitly, and it wasn't meant to be an accusation. It was meant to be a question. It seems to me like you're trying to argue for an exclusivity of narrative, that everything is narrative. And I was trying to say, that strikes me as dangerous, because then you are denying people access to things that are trans-narrative and pre-narrative by which we evaluate narratives and decide to abandon one narrative and move into another. So I'm wondering, that seems like that should be relevant to the Meta News project, right? Trying to get at, what is it that allows from the bottom up and from the top down people to move between narratives? Did that make sense?
Absolutely. And those three layers feel very intuitively correct, right? That there's something different between this worldview, which is like very huge and often pretty inarticulate, or at least it would take a long time to articulate it. And then the narrative, which instantiates it in relation to this issue. What's your narrative on this issue, basically, is kind of the way to do it. So that makes a lot of sense. And I think what's interesting, as I was listening, I was thinking a couple of things. One, I was thinking what's the difference between those who have that stack and are doing it unconsciously,
Right.
And those who have that second are doing it consciously. Many people have a completely inarticulate worldview. They've actually never really thought at the level of worldview to like work it out, but they have a lot of narratives which imply an inarticulate worldview, right? And so I'm thinking the implicit, explicit thing. And then I'm also thinking the ability for certain media to like take narrative out of the stack and just operate on narrative as if it didn't have to be constrained by those two. And this is what we see in the news. And then, so then there's this incompatibility where an authority figure gives you a narrative about a particular issue, which doesn't actually jive with your worldview or your embodied dialogical experience, right?
Yes.
And so then you have these free floating kind of weird parasitic created narratives, right? So that was the other thought I had, which is where it comes into the consilience. And the final point was that as a developmental psychologist, we actually look a lot at how narratives change. Like that's one of the ways to actually think about development, is that this narrative, the deeper structures of the possibility for narrative are changing and growing. And so there's this Habermasian line, which is it's translated from German, so I don't know what it actually is, but it says something like, it's not learning that needs to be explained. It's not learning that needs to be explained. You see? And I use this phrase a lot, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but it's a very important point, which is that narratives change because they're all self-terminating, because they're all actually in relationship to a world which is greater than their explanatory capacity. So in proper situations, the narrative has a built-in kind of growth function, I would say, within certain limits. But in let's say an ideological situation, and this was Habermas's point, that was his definition of ideology. It's that which stops the learning process from its natural course. So it's the idea of not how do narratives change, but how is it that they're not changing? How is it that people are getting stuck? And I think it has to do with all these narratives that are taken out of the stack and worked on and brought, like bolted on instead of organically growing. And then it's like, you can't move this thing because it's been bolted on. It didn't actually come from your experience. It's like given to you by the New York Times or something, and you're trying to fit it into your experience. And so that's key to get. And similar things happen in, of course, development. Like you see people with warps in their developmental trajectory, which make it so that there are some narratives which exist irrespective of the practice and the worldview. Like this is the kind of like hypocrisies of self that most people live with. I'm sure that I do, and I can't see them, but it's like that sense of you're telling yourself a particular story, even though you're contradicting yourself in practice, and you don't really believe that. And then the question of what one really believes, that's where it gets interesting and deeper than what I believe the Consilience Project can do, which is to say, like, you can work at the level of narrative, but working at the level of worldview is a different beast. Like it's not, I don't think it can be engineered or planned. Worldviews emerge in very complex ways over long periods of time for individuals, especially inarticulate ones. Like people who are philosophers think explicitly about their worldview. And so it will change more probably predictably. But if you're just growing up in the milieu of culture, you'll go through these life phases and your worldview will change, but over the 5 to 6 to 10 year frame, whereas your narrative will change in a weekly frame about some things, right? And so there's that sense to me of like, I know I can kind of understand how to work at the level of narrative, but how to work at the level of worldview transformation is one of the things that it's a sticky wicket, because that's my fear of like the Consilience Project can do so much, and the sense-making movement can do so much, but there's a way that it's limited to the dimensions of the problem that's already been kind of given to us. Whereas the emergence of something fundamentally new, a new worldview, I don't feel like that can be planned or
manufactured.
See what I'm saying? So I'm not, that's like an open question for me. It's like the edge of my thinking. And it is, of course, what people used to do who founded religions, but they didn't at the time hold the project reflectively and self-consciously in that way, which is to say, it's like, as soon as you try to start a religion, you've probably failed to start an actual religion.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Scientology or something.
Well, yeah, well, and the refounding of most of the major religions,
Yeah.
which is like, Paul and et cetera. And so there's this question of, what does that, how do we do that work? And in good conscience and earnest, like, because that's a huge, I think, issue on the horizon for us as the horror and the beauty of the world continue to deepen. People will be needing new worldview to inform new narrative.
I've heard this expression, tribal block. I don't know where I heard it from, but it seems that people who are brought up in like a traditional religion, have a very deep understanding of the world, but are often unable to step out of that. But that's not only just a traditional religion, but then people who are brought up with modernism are unable to step out of that. And then people who are brought up with scientism are unable to step out of that. And there's these sort of tribal blocks where people don't have sort of permeable membranes where they can experience other kinds of realities other than their own. So there's this sort of, I don't know if we're just very tribal or something, and it's hard to break out of that.
I think, there's lots of research shows that we at a very fast implicit level make judgments of allegiance and team membership. You can do this even with putting people in a room and putting on one set of people are wearing red t-shirts, the other are wearing blue t-shirts, and that's the only difference. And that cuts across gender and race. And the red-shirted people will just tend to like the other red-shirted people better, just as so there's lots of evolutionary shit in us that we've got to own up to, and we've got to acknowledge that it's there, and it, like everything else evolutionary, it's going to be compelling, and like many things that are evolutionary, it is liable to be maladaptive right now, and so we need to get aware of that more.
Yeah. But in terms of narrative and let's say post-narrative, in terms of going beyond our narrative about reality and getting to the stage of post-narrative, where we don't have such a fixed vision of or version of what reality is or something.
Well, here's where I'm following a bit of a Platonic intuition, or Socratic intuition, perhaps. Maybe that's better. Wisdom begins in wonder, or the Gospel of John, the second book of the Bible that begins within the beginning. And those are the two books that are introducing the worldviews, right? In the beginning, right? And the second book is in the beginning is the Logos. And it doesn't say in the beginning was the mythos, right? And there's something really important there. There's something important about, and you see this in Plato. The worldview is breaking down. The Homeric gods don't work because they're not moral exemplars. That worldview is breaking down. And then people are getting locked into political narratives. That's clearly what's happening. And Plato thinks, I'm attributing something to him, and it's anachronistic to a degree, but he thinks if you drop down to the level of dialogos, you will get people, you will educate people in tasting what to care about and to take seriously within a framing of wonder, the ability to call the self and the worldview into question, such that a new worldview is possible. And
so it's not strictly speaking a stack, it's some kind of
And maybe we're in this transition period right now on some level, or
well, I think we are. I don't think it's the same, and so I worry about anachronistic bias. But really all we have is history. And so I'm trying to look to that period and the Socratic practice, and how, because what basically happens is you get this weird thing, and Zach, maybe you're right, maybe it's like this, you get the dialogos, and then you get the Platonic worldview, and then you get a retelling of what the gods are like. The gods become moral exemplars in the Platonic tradition, right? And then new narratives emerge. And so
new gods emerge.
New gods. The one is, the ultimate God, and it is not a god. It's not a nit either, right? But the point I'm trying to make is, I think the stack is a good way of thinking, but I want to see it. I'm trying to say it seems to me like more of a dynamical system, and that dynamical systems, if you can find points of intervention that have the greatest chance to perturb the whole, and and I'm not saying this is the only way. I'm not saying that, but I'm very interested in the Dialogos project as a way of trying to find a perturbation point that has the potential to propagate and get both the top and bottom resonating different with each other, so new narratives are possible for us. That's sort of what I'm envisioning and what I'm trying to bring into practice.
I love that answer, and it vibes with my thinking about where a new metaphysics could emerge from. I've always said that it has to emerge like right here, basically between us. And this is Gaffney and I's sense of the anthro-ontology. It's like we can't look to science, we can't look to the old religions. We actually have to return to the nature of the person and what we can definitively know about one another just by virtue of being in conversation. And so that sense of, there's a humanism to it, but it's not an anthropocentrism, because it's a radical realism in terms of its cosmological assumptions. And so I think, we fundamentally agree there. So that what that means is we need to create a lot of contexts for people to be engaging in these kinds of conversations. And then there needs to be some way to gather it together. And I don't know what that looks like, but
which is the meaning of logos, right? To gather together so things belong together. But the thing is, I mean, these communities are springing up all over the place, and not without cause, not without reason. And they are also trying to talk to each other. And I don't know, I'm not trying to pull a meta consilience, but there has to be something about how we're stewarding the media world and how that is responsive to this mid, like we have to be responsible to the media, but we have to be responsible we have to be midwives for the new cosmology, right?
How much of that would be aesthetic? Like, I think of Marshall McLuhan, he says the medium is the message, or the environment is the message, or just the aesthetic, or the metaphors we use, or the symbolism we use, or the beauty perhaps that we do, the way that is done.
That one of the jobs of the sacred is to get us to take the imaginal very seriously, which I think is one way, very much Plato's way, of talking about what beauty is, right? That beauty is, right, the enacted serious play, the imaginal, that catches. Ellen Scarry argues this in her beautiful little book, no pun intended, on beauty and how it trains us for justice. It actually trains us for truth and justice, because she says that what beauty is this, and notice how it has that structure of plausibility. So she says, you see this tree, and it's a beautiful tree, and all the previous trees you've seen get converged into it. There's the convergence. And so it's a very trustworthy tree. But then you realize, I didn't realize trees could be like that. It also opens up in insight, right? That's what beauty is. And trees can be other than I thought them to be. So it gathers all the previous trees. This is a very trustworthy, this is like to use your language, it's an archetypal tree. But precisely because of that, it makes me, wow, I didn't realize trees could be like that. And correspondingly, I didn't realize I could be like that in relationship to trees. And I think beauty,
that's the sacred too, isn't it?
Yes,
and
that's what I'm saying.
And all that is like this portal into that communication, which is happening all the time, which we don't see.
But do you see how I'm saying beauty is like, it's plausibility machinery on steroids. It's getting massive convergence, massive elegance, deep balance, and you're put into a state where you are open to learning, you're wondering. So
the dialogos has to be beautiful. And it's similar with the ensoulment dynamic. Like, the beautiful is that doorway into the moral and the ethical and the epistemologically true. And so I think about the temple. I think about temple building and the history of the history of the temple, the history of the temple building mysticism, and the notion of building the temple in time rather than in space. But the notion that it still needs to be beautiful, right? And that's the allure of the temple. And so I imagine, that there's some beautiful type of new space that needs to be built, right? A new type of sacred space to be built, and then the people will come to do the dialogos within it. And it's possible that no other space I don't know what it looks like. It may be digital. It may in fact be awaiting some new up-leveling of the digital. It could be different. It could be a return to some more indigenous embodied modalities. I just don't know. But I do know that your insight is good, Andrew, which is that there's an aesthetic function.
Yeah, totally.
And there's a contextual containment function. So I think about, it's the building the temple in which to allow for the dialogos.